I left Brazil behind and moved to Ontario, Canada to work with my brother at his church. Little did I know that this would be the staging ground for some of the biggest changes of my entire life. It's 2007, and we just bought a townhouse in Mississauga, Ontario, the city without a soul. It's a nice city with lots of new homes in 2007, but it was like living in the United Nations. We counted over 20 different nationalities living on just our little street. Mississauga is not a destination, it's a place near Toronto. It hosts Toronto's major airport as its biggest claim to fame. But in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was a growing city and an ideal placement for a new church. My brother and some friends from Bible college started a new church there, and it grew rapidly. But growth can lead to challenges, and one of those challenges was relying on volunteers to staff your off-stage programs. Week after week, it seemed that one or more of the volunteer staff was unable to perform their role. Before I arrived, that often meant that my brother would get a call on Sunday morning saying that since they or a family member was sick, he would need to find someone to cover for them that morning. This was causing a lot of stress on my brother, and the church knew that it would only be solved by hiring another staff member to take care of that for him. When I arrived in the summer of 2007, plans for the 2007-2008 school year had already been made. The church planned their calendar around the school calendar since most people in the church were comfortable with that schedule. I was told that I would ease into my role by taking care of the immediate needs of administration, of the Sunday morning offstage program, and the youth programs. But otherwise, I would mostly be observing and absorbing the culture of that church. I would be heavily involved in the planning for the 2008-2009 school year, so I had basically a year to soak it all in. To say that the church was a good fit for me would be an understatement. The role fit me like a glove, and everything at the church seemed to get better and better with time. Within less than 2 years, we were able to move out of the rented school building where we had to set up chairs every Sunday, and we moved into a 20,000 square foot building of our own with plenty of space for the auditorium, Sunday school classrooms, and offices. 2 significant things happened for me in the first year there that would change the course of my life. The first was that since I had so much free time due to not needing to create a plan for the 07-08 school year, I decided to research a doctrinal issue that had been nagging at me for years. The second was my first pastoral counseling session. I was taught that when it comes to the doctrine of last things, that the rapture of the church would happen before the Great Tribulation. The theory is called pre-tribulation, indicating that Jesus will come in the clouds and receive his followers just prior to 7 years of hell on earth. Although I had heard this theory touted many times, I had never been shown, not even at Bible college, the biblical support for the theory outside of a couple of go-to passages that were less than a slam dunk, in my opinion. So in the spirit of scientific process, I took the position that the pre-tribulation theory is correct, and I attempted to conclusively prove that the theory was true. I worked on this exercise for about a full month, going over everything that I could get my hands on. I read the supporters as well as the critics, but I especially read the source material. And in the end, I came to the conclusion that the pre-tribulation theory was not only flawed, it was completely wrong. Today, I believe that if the rapture of the saints is indeed a literal event, that it will most likely happen as a post-tribulation event. I'd had my first taste of the red pill. One day, only a few months into my tenure at the church, a man strolled into the church office. This was before we had our own building, and the office was in an industrial park, far from where people tended to walk, so we rarely ever got a walk-in. The man said that he was feeling depressed and was asking for a pastoral counseling session with my brother. My brother, who had plenty of other things to do, saw an opportunity to pass him off to me, since at the time I was basically sitting around studying theology and I had plenty of time to spend with him. The man was known to the office staff as he had been attending the church for a while. He was someone who was looking for free help as a benefit of being a regular attender. In theory, the staff have no idea how much anyone gives to the bottom line of the church. But in reality, we knew that this man had probably never given more than a couple of dollars to the church in all the time that he had attended. If you didn't know better, you would assume that he was homeless based on how he dressed and how he carried himself. So he ended up in my office, and I just let him talk for a while. It turns out that despite his appearance, the man was highly intelligent and a real jokester. I took a liking to him right away, and he seemed to appreciate my company. So despite me not having any formal training in counseling, he kept coming back to talk with me in my office about 2 or 3 times per month. These meetings would turn into a friendship that extended well beyond my days at the church. This man would much later pass away and leave all of his worldly possessions to me. But that's a story for another day. Things continued to go well at the church, which somewhat surprisingly led to a peak in my relationship with my wife. Apparently, when women continually tell your wife that they think that her husband is a great guy in various ways, it makes her think that she should give him better treatment. I enjoyed my best years with Shannon while serving as a pastor at that church. Unfortunately, the highest highs would be followed by some of the lowest lows. In 2009, I turned 40. As a surprise for this milestone, my wife treated me to a trip to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where my favorite sports team, the Penguins, played. We went to a game together and had what seemed like a short second honeymoon there. My kids were flourishing at the Christian high school that they were attending at the time, and all seemed well. I remember thinking that my life was as close to perfect as I had ever experienced. And then one day, in the spring of 2009, I got a call from one of the ladies at the church that attended many of my Sunday morning classes. She told me that she had recently seen a YouTube video that had shaken her faith. She asked me if I would be willing to watch the video and get back to her with answers to help her regain her faith. Of course, I was happy to help her out. The video was called Zeitgeist the Movie. The movie has 3 parts. The first part is about how Jesus is similar to the ancient sun deities. This was the part that had my friend upset. But I didn't know that until after I had watched the whole video. The second part was all about how what happened on 9/11 might have been very different from the official story we were told about it. And the third part was about the banking system and how it manipulates the masses. I had never seen anything like this before, and while I was able to help out my friend with the Jesus part, I couldn't unsee what I had seen about the rest of the movie. On September 11, 2001, I had been living in Philadelphia and working at a newspaper in Bucks County, less than 100 kilometers from downtown New York City, and not a tremendous distance more to both Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and Washington, D.C. We felt like we were in the center of the storm that day. I distinctly remember saying to myself that morning as I drove in to work that today is the definition of a perfect weather day. Warm but not hot, and not a cloud in the sky. When I got to work, everyone was standing around staring at the TV screens. I had been listening to music on the CD player in the car, so I had no idea what was going on. When I arrived, the first tower had been recently hit. It didn't take very long before the publisher told everybody to go home, except a skeleton crew from the news team, but not before the second tower was hit. I picked up the kids from school and we went home, and like most people, we were glued to the TV coverage of what was going on. I remember thinking that the buildings reminded me of the demolition scenes I had seen before, but I didn't dare to question the official narrative. It also seemed really strange to me that the planes in Shanksville and the Pentagon basically evaporated. Well, after seeing Zeitgeist, I decided I needed to know if there was any truth to what they were saying. I spent several hours per day for months researching everything I could get my hands on about 9/11. Back in those days, YouTube wasn't highly censored like it is today, and neither was Google. If you knew what you were looking for, you could generally find it. What I discovered not only flipped my paradigm, but I literally experienced an irregular heartbeat for months. My whole world had changed. So when I realized that governments will kill and tell huge whopper lies, I figured I ought to see if there was any truth to what the video had said about the banks. Only this time, I could do the research firsthand. I'm going to save the stories about what I learned about the banks for its own video. Otherwise, this one will become a marathon of sorts. While all this study of 9/11 was going on, I was still working at the church, and I was teaching a Sunday morning adult class on the book of Romans for the first time. When I got to chapter 9, something hit me. It wasn't a voice in my head, but it was this powerful urge that made me want to write a book about hell. You see, in all my days as a good Christian boy, believing everything that I was being told the Bible said, I could never make sense of the idea that a God who created us and loves us and who is in us could send us to hell forever to suffer. But when I read Romans 9, it just clicked. Nobody's going to spend eternity in hell. The Bible itself makes that clear. Up to that point, I had believed the lie that the point of our lives was to search for and find the truth that would save us from eternal damnation. And of course, the truth was Jesus. But then there were many different flavors of how that truth played out. And it was of critical importance that we find the right flavor of Jesus. Because even though the Catholics believe in Jesus, they're still going to hell. And even though the Pentecostals believe in Jesus, they're still going to hell. And ultimately, everyone in their own little camp believed that they were the ones who would be saved, and everyone else was at risk of eternity in hell. So I started writing my book. Step 1 was to read the entire Bible and take notes on anything that mentioned heaven or hell or anything related to those topics. I discovered that the Bible actually has at least 25 ways of proving directly from the Bible text itself that nobody is going to spend eternity in hell. But people don't want to hear that. They would rather believe that because in a few places the Bible says that people are cast into the eternal flames of hell, that there is no escape and there's no forgiveness. I've come to the place in my life that if that's what you want to believe, go ahead. Your quality of life will be reflected by what you believe. I didn't self-publish the book digitally until I got to Texas a few years later, as the book took me more than 4 years to complete. My father read it, and it started a chain reaction of damage to our relationship. My wife refused to even read the book, since she knew what it said from all the conversations I'd had with her about it. When my marriage to Shannon started to crack, we tried going to a Christian marriage counselor. Shannon had plenty of ideas for ways that I could make our marriage better, but when the counselor heard my complaint that Shannon refused to read my book, she got really upset with Shannon. She ordered my wife to read my book that evening. The counseling sessions soon ended. But the relationship that took the greatest hit was my relationship with my employer. When word got out that I was writing a book that directly conflicted with the doctrines of the denomination I was working for, I was warned that I was playing with fire as it related to my job. Of course, the head of the business that I called the church that I worked at was my brother. His right-hand man, who worked for the denomination, was my best friend when we were in Bible college together. Within 2 years, I was given an ultimatum by these two people that I loved so much. They said, "We love the work that you're doing here at the church, and we'd love you to continue on here for as many years as you'd like. But you have to choose between what our doctrine says and what you claim to believe." And so I was fired by my own brother because I made the choice of sticking with what I had discovered for myself as truth. With my employment terminated, it was time for the next chapter in my story. but not before we ended up with a mini drama that lasted for about a year. I will make the next video about this hiatus period in my life, as well as to get into the things that I started to learn about the banks. But before I end this documentary about my time as a worker in a church, I want to tell you about a story that started in my childhood, but continued during this period of my life. One Sunday, when I was probably 12 or 13 years old, a traveling singer came to our little town and offered to sing at our church if we would take up a special offering just for him. Our pastor agreed to his terms. It wasn't uncommon to have traveling preachers at that time. This was the early 1980s. But a traveling singer that wasn't part of a band was quite unusual. He was introduced to us simply as Mr. McDonald, and he was the kind of character that one never forgets. He was very tall, probably 6'4" in height, maybe taller. He wore a white suit like Colonel Sanders of KFC fame, and his suit was decorated with flowers and pins and such, which reminded me of pictures that I'd seen of circus clowns. His enormous shoes did nothing to slow down the clown comparisons, and he was no ordinary sight, which made a young boy like me pay close attention to this character, because I could tell that this was not going to be an everyday experience. Of course, at that age, I was old enough that I no longer wanted to sit with my parents in church. I wanted to sit with my friends. So I remember sitting in the back row of the church with my eyes fixed on this giant clown in a white suit get up in front of the church and start singing. He didn't have a guitar or play the piano. He sang a cappella. He clasped his hands together in front of his body, and he began to sing. When he sang, he moved his mouth like one sees a horse move his mouth when it's struggling to reach something with its lips. He had big teeth, and he opened his mouth so wide that I thought I would be able to see everything a dentist sees, even from the back row of the church. His voice was powerful, and he sang with conviction in a way that made you think that he was singing purely to God, rather than to a small crowd of about 70 people. At first, I was awestruck by this man's powerful voice, but it didn't take long before the mouth gyrations and those big teeth and the clown-like outfit he wore completely obliterated my sense of reverence. I don't know who laughed first, if it was me or one of my friends, but once we started laughing, we couldn't stop. I saw my mother give me that, if you don't control yourself now, you will pay for it later look. But I couldn't help it. My friends and I lost it. We just couldn't help ourselves, as much as we tried to stop. By the time he stopped singing, I felt completely embarrassed about how I acted, but there was nothing at that point that I could do. It was a hilarious performance. Well, as fate would have it, our little church only had 2 exits. The main one upstairs and another one downstairs that led to the parking lot. My mother told me that exiting through the lower door was not an option that Sunday morning because Mr. McDonald was standing at the front door saying goodbye to everyone as they left the building after church. I was being forced to confront the man I laughed at. I stood a short distance from the narrow door, waiting for my chance to catch Mr. McDonald busy with someone else in hopes that I could slip by him. I noticed him get into a conversation with one of the adults, and so I took the opportunity to bolt. Just as I got to the door, he extended his long arm in front of me to block my path. I was caught. He stopped the conversation that he was having mid-sentence and shifted all of his attention onto me. I looked at him with fear, ready to accept my well-deserved admonishment for my behavior, when he looked square into my eyes and said, "My boy, someday God is going to use you in a powerful way." I waited for the other shoe to drop, but then he smiled, dropped his arm, and let me out. My mother had witnessed this entire interaction with interest, as she was expecting me to get my comeuppance, and she was as surprised as I was by what he said. That sentence haunted me for years. What did it mean? When was someday? Why me? And who was this man to give me such a message? He didn't say anything like that to anyone else at the church that day. Although I thought about that statement many times after that day, Eventually, it became just a story of mine that had little impact on my life. That was until I met a man who was called a prophet near the end of my time as a worker at the church. Over my years at the church, I had made friends with some of the parishioners that regularly attended my Sunday morning classes. We also had what we called community groups, where people from the church who lived near enough to each other would meet once or more per month during the week in a more informal setting to get to know each other more as friends and to support each other that way. One couple in particular became quite close to Shannon and I. They had adult children who were a few years older than ours, but despite the age difference, we got along really well. One day, during our community group meeting, we got talking about this man who was part of a house church in Hamilton, Ontario, where the daughter of the woman in this couple attended. She told us that he could predict the future. He was referred to as the prophet. And from everything she told us, his predictions, which he did not make very often, always came true. Our friends were very eager for my wife and I to meet this guy, as none of us had ever met anyone who claimed to have the gift of prophecy before. We were both very eager to take them up on the offer. Our friends were especially excited about introducing us to him because they had recently seen confirmation of a prophecy that he had given to the daughter who regularly attended that house church. He told the daughter one day, before the daughter knew the sex of the child she was carrying, that he saw a vision of a little girl playing in front of a brick house with a certain color trim and a little fence around the front yard. That couple had been thinking that since they were now expecting their first child, that they should look for a bigger house to live in. They started looking for a home shortly after the prophecy, and they ended up finding what they thought was the perfect home. The new home looked nothing like the house that the prophet described, but they did find out through an ultrasound that the baby was a girl. When it came time for the closing, something went wrong with the financing and the deal fell through. The couple had to start looking again for a house, and they ended up finding an even better place that looked exactly as the prophet had described. It was only a couple of weeks after the daughter and her husband moved into this prophesied house that the four of us visited this house church. Now, I don't know why I expected more, but we were literally sitting in the living room of this family home with about 8 other people. We all introduced ourselves by name and a little bit about ourselves, but nobody introduced themselves as the prophet. We sang a few songs, we had a little devotional message, and then, as they always did, we gathered in the kitchen and dining room for some refreshments and conversation. It was at this time that our friend pointed out that the man who had been sitting right next to me on the sofa was the prophet we had hoped to see. She introduced me to him, and immediately he went into a trance-like state. His eyes had this hollow look to them, like the man was no longer completely there. My friend asked the prophet if he had a message for me, to which he replied that he did. From that point on, for about the next 10 minutes, a spirit communicated to me through him, and it spoke to me as if I was some holy roller. The spirit gushed about how excited it was to meet me, and that I would take the time to come and see him. He went on and on about what a blessing it was to be in my presence and that I was this powerful spiritual entity. I've forgotten most of the specifics of the message, but the general idea was that I was some powerful spiritual being that this spirit had been looking forward to meeting as if it was the highlight of his existence. Again, this went on and on for like 10 minutes to the point that I was starting to get embarrassed and my wife was starting to get annoyed. Plus, by this time, everyone in the house was focused on what the prophet was saying to me. I stopped the man and asked him, "Do you also have a message for my wife?" To which he responded, "Yes, I do." This pleased my wife greatly until he gave her the message. The message was simple, clear, and very short. He looked at her and said, "Don't be afraid." Sensing the disappointment coming from my wife, I asked him, "Can you be more specific? What is she not to be afraid of?" The prophet seemed to reach into the spiritual realm and came back with, "I don't have anything more to say to her except, don't be afraid." At that time, I had been heavily involved in experiments with the banks and with the government, And my wife had told me many times that she was afraid that what I was doing was going to cause problems for us, and that terrible things were likely to happen to us if I didn't stop what I was doing. She had begged me to stop. She knew, and I knew, what the message from the prophet to her was about, and Shannon was not happy about it. We were both blown away and puzzled by this outpouring of adoration from the prophet towards me, but we had no way of understanding what it meant. I now had a second witness to the message that I'd received so many years ago. I went home that night stunned like a deer staring into the headlights of an oncoming automobile. All of those feelings and questions from my childhood came rushing back. Who am I? Was the main question I was asking now. I was very confused, but also very excited. Maybe there was something to this message from the crazy singing man after all.